Happy week 2. My name is Tiffany Fuentes, and I'm here to discuss the main differences between the sympathetic nervous system, other known as SNS, as well as the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, in this presentation. Alright, so just to introduce the two kind of main objectives here, the autonomic nervous system, also known as ANS, can be divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. While the SNS activates the body and prepares it for fight and flight, the PSNS helps calm down the body once the stimulating event has passed. Therefore, it's important for disaster mental health counselors to be aware of the impact that dramatic events can have on an individual's SNS and PSNS because it impacts the stimulation of one's fight, flight, freeze, or faint response and the rest and digest response. So just a little quick tip of what I kind of use to kind of decipher the differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic. So in Spanish, like in regards for parasympathetic nerves, para, which is the first couple of words in parasympathetic, means to stop. So when I think about that, I think of how it's kind of slowing the heartbeat, and it's not really stimulating the body for action because it's actually trying to slow down the body after the event has occurred. So that's how I kind of decipher the differences between parasympathetic nerves and the sympathetic nerves. Furthermore, the autonomic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system that acts as a control system functioning largely below the level of consciousness and controls the bodily functions. Some of the aspects that it's responsible for controls the involuntary or the visceral bodily functions such as the cardiovascular, the respiratory, digestive tract, urinary glands, reproductive functions, and key roles in the body's response to stress. So for some further background on the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is activation that's involved in states of stress, from mild activation to the extremely aroused responses associated with threat, flight, fight, and freeze. The SNS has also been referred to as an excitatory or accelerator, and when the SNS is activated, the viscera and visceral muscles will be stimulated to send large amounts of oxygen to the muscles for quick and strong movement. So kind of in the picture on the right-hand side, the sympathetic response is the fight or flight response. So it looks like that figure is looking ready to either run or fight. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated in states of rest and restoration. The PNS can also be referred to as inhibitory or the brake when the PNS is activated, the main concern is to send blood flow to the digestive system to absorb nutrient and as well to keep the skin warm. To accomplish this, the pulse and respiration will slow and the nervous system that calms. So as you can see on the right-hand side in the graphic, it looks like the figure is ready to sleep, and it's kind of just stating how that person is kind of resting and restoring basically their body since they had to undergo that traumatic event. One of the theories that I wanted to go over was the Porges polyvagal theory. The Porges major theory concerns identification of separate actions of two distinct complexes of the vagus nerve on the ANS, the ventral branch at the front of the body and the dorsal, which is at the back of the body. Porges' theory had helped both researchers and practitioners to make better sense of what is happening in individuals when they are calm, which is the ventral vagus, and when they collapse under the most extreme stress or they have a threat to life, which initiates the dorsal vagus. Porges suggested that activation in the ventral brass of the vagus nerve associates to the action of calming aspects of the PNS. When the parasympathetic ventral vagal is most active, the nervous system is in a mostly calming state. On the other hand, Porges stated that activation in the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve to the extreme trauma response of flaccid muscle freezing. He views this dorsal vagal freeze as a hyperarousal state connected to an excessive activation of the paradynamic nervous system. The result is a dramatic shutdown of traumatic hyperarousal, which leads to immobilization and collapse. In regards to the sextuple ANS theory, especially when working with traumatized individuals, it is hard to determine the distinguished levels of arousal within the branches of sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. For example, PNS activation, which is usually thought of as a good thing, calm and restorative, can actually be dangerous if the PNS activates too high, and it can therefore be very draining if the arousal goes too low. The main purpose of the table on the next slide is to help practitioners to specifically identify what to look for when observing ANS states in clients and in themselves. For the client, this will mean increasing opportunities to reduce or even eventually prevent dysregulation, catching a rise in arousal before it gets out of control. The table also provides general guidance on how to intervene therapeutically depending on what is observed. One of the things that I found very interesting in this week's readings was kind of suggesting how clients as well as counselors should also keep one of these graphics on hand just to ensure that they are on the right track and that they are preventing dysregulation for future life obstacles that may come their way. So also one of the things that we discussed was observing the 3 levels of SNS arousal. People with normally regulated nervous systems and life situations routinely swing between low and moderate levels of arousal, depending on whether they are at rest or are mildly stressed with everyday kinds of situations or demands. On the second level, arousal within the threat to life range dysregulates and pushes the ANS to the reactions of flight, fight, and freeze. On the other end of the spectrum, which is the third level, PNS 1 column represents a state where arousal is too low to function well, and symptoms such as depression, apathy, and chronic fatigue fall into this category. So again, how we kind of discussed how the autonomic nervous system precision regulation chart, it kind of describes on what to look for, and based on the colors, which is between yellow and kind of a dark maroon, it kind of just suggests how some of the primary states may need to be alerted as well as just looked upon in case a counselor or client finds themselves heading towards the orange or the pink or maroon level. Finally, this next slide describes the brain and the body and how they both are changed during and after a traumatic event. Immediately after a disaster or a mass traumatic event, survivors will typically appear in shock or various other ranges of behaviors or responses, including not feeling emotions, feeling numb, being jumpy, irritable, or tightly wired, having difficulty making eye contact, speaking in short, terse sentences in present tense, shaking and trembling, shuddering and breathing quickly and shallowly, and finally having difficulty making decisions or initiating action on their own. Although there is growing evidence that many people emerge emotionally stronger after disasters and mass violence events, without developing either acute or chronic PTSD, through a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. When I heard of the term post-traumatic growth, my first thought was resilience and how many individuals develop resilient characteristics after undergoing such traumatic events. Post-traumatic growth, though, means that people with adequate support and coping skills can muster the emotional, social, and psychological resources necessary to cope with and make sense of disastrous events and locate the experience within their overall life stories. That kind of goes in how we were discussing the difference between traumatic memories and narrative memories, and how traumatic memories may be more vivid and in detail compared to narrative memories because of the traumatic event and how it really held on to them and consumed them in those moments. They make sense of the event and find solace in available psychological, social, and spiritual resources, and being able to reflect on the ways in which the event may have changed themselves for the better defines resilience and how they can use these characteristics and how they even have these tools within themselves. Finally, some techniques that have been found useful for those who have also undergone traumatic events. Neurobiology explains why people experience negative changes in their thoughts and emotional reactions after a disaster, why they do not feel better even though time has passed, and why previously neutral situations or circumstances can be interpreted as threatening. Talk therapy by itself can be insufficient to process traumatic events or to affect closure or healing of traumatic memories. The textbook also described how movement combined with mindfulness appear to counteract the cortical thinning effects of PTSD. Dance therapy used with women worldwide was reported to prove significant reduction of trauma-associated symptoms and increased connection to dance, spirituality, and healing. So the images that I actually attached to this slide, the first one is of karate. So when I was in 8th grade, I actually joined a karate team, and for me that really developed my resilience as well as dedication and discipline. So I think that being able to combine movement with therapeutic events, not just talk therapy, can really impact an individual and how, as well as their outlook on life. And finally, on the picture on the lower right-hand side, we see some individuals partaking in yoga. So for the department that I used to work for, the Cross-Cultural Center actually incorporates yoga as well as therapeutic techniques in order to help their clients heal from traumatic events such as rape or other assaults. So being able to work with that department was very healing, not only for me, but as well as for the individuals involved and who participated, because we used a lot of counseling techniques and volunteers were able to also help and not just kind of incorporate talk therapy, but we also used movement to kind of guide our thoughts. In conclusion, disasters and mass violence cause traumatic stress to interfere with the brain's ability to put events in sequence, describe them in words, and establish ownership of their memories. Psychological trauma leaves a psychological footprint. However, counselors can help survivors rally both physical and mental resources to prevent the negative effects of trauma from taking root in the first place by providing safety, reassurance, structure, and faster return to pre-disaster functioning. Some natural phases of recovery that were described in our text. The first phase of recovering from a disaster or mass trauma event is to establish safety and security. The second phase works through mindfully and imaginable doses the problematic areas of disaster memory, that is, anywhere the survivor feels stuck or overwhelmed by the circumstances or sensory experiences of the disaster. Therefore, talking about how they might feel stuck in their current state can really help these individuals kind of move past that and kind of look for the resources within them to kind of get out of that state of mind. Finally, the third phase consolidates gains, integrates the disaster into a coherent life story, and prepares for termination of treatment, facing life with newfound skills and confidence in one's ability to weather future storms. Therefore, in this third phase, the client has officially developed resilience skills as well as coping mechanisms that will be beneficial not only for the event that they have overcome, but for events that might take place in the future. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week too.